The story begins not in the warmth of a hearth, not in the laughter of a tribe, but in silence. A silence so deep it feels eternal, the kind of silence only found in landscapes where life has been pushed to the brink. Here, in the northern reaches of the world, the ground is not simply soil, it is ice, locked hard for tens of thousands of years. Winds whistle across frozen plains, dragging with them shards of snow that sting the skin like tiny knives. It is here, buried beneath this unyielding surface, that a secret lay waiting for millennia, a child. Her story begins, and ends, before her first birthday. Yet, paradoxically, her story never ended at all. Because the earth itself cradled her body in a coffin of frost, preserving her in such a way that she became both lost and found, both dead and alive, both past and present. She is one of the youngest witnesses to an age we can only reconstruct in fragments, and yet she speaks across time with more power than kings and empires that would follow long after her. Imagine the moment of discovery, an excavation team hunched against the bitter wind, scraping gently at layers of permafrost. What might have looked, at first, like stone reveals, under careful hands, the delicate curve of a skull no bigger than a hand, fragile as porcelain. The permafrost has kept her astonishingly intact, hair strands, traces of skin, even the small bones of fingers curled inward as though she still sleeps. She is not a skeleton, she is a time capsule. We call her, the child who froze before her first birthday, a phrase that feels both brutal and tender. Brutal, because it reminds us of the harsh fate that snatched her before she had even spoken her first words. Tender, because in some strange way the frost itself protected her, held her with a kind of unfeeling kindness, shielding her from the rot and decay that consumes all others. For 30,000 years, or perhaps more, she has waited, buried in silence while glaciers advanced and retreated, while mammoths and lions thundered above her, while the first sparks of civilization ignited thousands of miles away. Empires rose and fell, yet she remained still, untouched. And when she is finally uncovered, she does not emerge as a fossilized relic, but as something intimate, immediate, heartbreakingly familiar. She is not a painting on a cave wall, nor a chipped flint blade. She is a person, a child, a daughter. Her existence reminds us that deep history is not only about survival strategies or evolutionary adaptations, it is also about love, about loss, about the most delicate fibers of human life. The camera of imagination lingers on her face, as if peering through the ice. What was the last thing she saw? Was it the glow of firelight on animal skin stretched around her family's shelter? Was it the face of her mother leaning close, singing softly in a language now forever vanished? Or was it only the dark, the final breath in the chill of night? We do not know, and yet we feel. Because the child who froze before her first birthday is not simply a case study or a specimen. She is a mirror. In her tiny, fragile bones lies the weight of all humanity, the reminder that life has always been uncertain, that children have always been vulnerable, that grief has always been part of what it means to be human. This is where our story begins, with an infant who could not survive the ice, but who, through that same ice, has survived across time itself. She is not a hero in the traditional sense. She did not grow to hunt mammoths, or lead her tribe, or invent new tools. Her role was different. She endured the cold long enough to be preserved by it, and in doing so, she became a voice for all the unnamed, forgotten children of prehistory. To tell her story is to step back into the Ice Age, into a world alien and yet deeply familiar. It is to walk alongside her people, feel the bite of the wind, hear the crackle of fire, and glimpse what it meant to bring life into a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. The child's body is not just a discovery, it is an invitation to journey into the past, to listen closely to voices that were never recorded, to imagine lives that were never written down. It asks us to reconsider what we mean by memory, by ancestry, by humanity itself. And so we begin our descent into time, into the frozen earth, into the world she inhabited, into the fleeting, fragile heartbeat of a child who never lived to speak her name, but who now, across thousands of years, will speak to us. This is her story. Time usually slips away from us quietly. Days dissolve into months, months into years, until only fragments remain. But ice has a different relationship with time. It does not allow it to pass freely. Instead, it seizes it, clutches it, and refuses to let go. For the child who froze before her first birthday, the permafrost became both tomb and guardian. Her body, so delicate and unfinished, should have been consumed long ago. The soil should have broken her down, the air should have scattered her into nothing. But instead, the cold held her still, as if nature itself pressed pause on a single fragile life. When archaeologists uncovered her, what they held in their hands was not simply the bones of a baby. They held a moment from 30,000 years ago that had not been allowed to pass, a breath that had been suspended mid-inhale, a heartbeat that had stopped, but had not been erased. It is almost unbearable to imagine. In the warmth of a lab, under the bright glow of artificial light, a child who died when the world was still ruled by mammoths suddenly lay before living eyes. She had no name, no words, no story of her own, yet she felt immediate, like a person you might have passed on the street just yesterday. This is the strange power of preservation. It makes the ancient feel present. It makes the impossibly distant feel familiar. We look at her and realize 30,000 years is not as vast as it sounds. In the curve of her face, in the softness of her bones, in the tenderness of her small hands, we see our own children, our nieces, our brothers and sisters. We see ourselves. Time, normally merciless, had made a rare concession. It had granted her a kind of immortality. And yet it is an immortality without voice, without movement, a paradox of being both here and not here. We can see her, but we cannot hear her laugh. We can study her, but we cannot ask what she dreamt of. The moment time stopped for her is captured in ice, but it is incomplete. It is both a gift and a wound. The gift is obvious. We glimpse a life we were never meant to know. Without this strange pause, her story would have been erased completely. She would have returned to dust before a single human knew she existed. The wound, however, is deeper, because all that remains is her stillness. The frost preserved her body, but not the warmth of her life. The motion of her eyes, the curve of a smile, the sound of her first attempts at language, all of that is gone forever. In this way, her frozen form is both presence and absence. She is there, but she is not. It is easy to think of time as linear, as something that marches forward without care for what it leaves behind. But the child in the ice reminds us that time can also be circular, that a life ended so long ago can return and touch the present. When we look at her, we are not only looking back, she is also reaching forward, reaching to us, to the future, to people she could never have imagined. There is something humbling, even unsettling, about this. The Ice Age, to most of us, is a distant abstraction, a series of facts in books, pictures of glaciers and extinct animals. But the frozen child cuts through that distance. She is not an idea. She is not a symbol. She is real. She reminds us that history is made not only of grand migrations and great hunters, but also of infants who never lived to grow teeth, mothers who wept, and fathers who buried their dead with trembling hands. For her tribe, time stopped the night she died. Her absence would have hung over the campfire, over the hunts, over the songs that carried them through long winters. And now, millennia later, time has stopped for us too, as we look at her, struck silent by the weight of her presence. She embodies a strange truth, that some lives echo not because they were long or full, but because they were interrupted, because they left a space that could never be filled. The ice that held her is more than frozen water, it is memory itself, dense and enduring. It locked away the air she once breathed, the pollen that drifted in the wind the year she was born, the bacteria that touched her skin, the very moment of her existence. To hold her is to hold a piece of time. To look upon her is to look upon a clock that stopped and never restarted. And in that frozen silence, she becomes more than just herself. She becomes a reminder of every fragile moment in human history that passed too quickly to be recorded, every child lost before language, every memory unspoken, every heartbeat that ended without descendants to carry it forward. She is proof that sometimes the past is not lost. Sometimes it waits, perfectly preserved, to confront us. And so, in the frozen child, we see time itself, stopped, waiting, and whispering. Not everything is gone. Not everything has slipped away. Some moments still remain, trembling quietly in the silence of the ice. Before we can understand the child, we must understand her world. The Ice Age was not simply cold, it was a kingdom of extremes. Imagine standing on an open plain that stretches further than the eye can see, the horizon shimmering with the white of snow and the gray of endless steppe. The wind does not whisper here, it roars, carrying with it the breath of glaciers that towered in the north. This was the stage upon which the child was born, a stage shared with creatures that to us seem mythological. To her people, however, they were daily reality. Woolly mammoths lumbered across the land in herds, their shaggy coats swaying as they carved paths through the snow. Their tusks curled like ivory crescents, weapons and tools waiting to be scavenged. To the tribe, the mammoth was food, shelter, clothing, and symbol all at once. A single animal could sustain a group for weeks, but it could also kill without hesitation. To hunt one required courage, cooperation, and no small measure of luck. Nearby, reindeer moved in vast migrations, their hooves drumming against the frozen earth like thunder. They were the lifeblood of the tundra, their flesh and hides keeping humans alive through brutal winters. But they were not easily caught. To track them was to follow them for days across hostile landscapes, always balancing hunger against exhaustion. And then there were predators. The cave lion, larger than any modern lion, stalked the same plains as her family. Its golden body slid through the grass and snow, silent until the final sprint. Hyenas, stronger and more ruthless than today's scavengers, worked in packs, tearing apart the weak. Even the wolf was a threat, not yet domesticated into the companion we know today, but a shadow on the edge of the firelight, watching, waiting. Above, the sky itself could turn predator. Storms could descend without warning, cloaking the steppe in white, erasing landmarks, burying camps in silence. Cold was not simply discomfort, it was death. A wind-chill shift of just a few degrees could end a life in hours, sometimes minutes. And yet it was not all terror. The world was also breathtaking. Herds of bison painted the horizon black as they moved together in waves. Giant deer raised antlers like crowns of bone against the dusk. The aurora danced across the night sky, shimmering ribbons of green and violet twisting above the icy plains. To the child's tribe, these lights may have been spirits, ancestors, or omens, mysteries flickering in the heavens, impossible to ignore. This environment shaped every breath the tribe took. Fire was not optional, it was survival itself. Without it, meat could not be softened, water could not be boiled, infants could not be warmed. Each spark struck from stone was a defiance against a world eager to extinguish them. For the child, the cold was an enemy she could not fight. She had no weapons, no strategies, no defenses beyond the warmth of her mother's body and the shelter of animal hide stretched across a fragile frame of wood and bone. The world outside her cradle was one of giants and predators, of ice that reached deep into the earth, of nights so long they seemed eternal. And yet life pulsed stubbornly. Her tribe adapted in countless ways. They moved constantly, following migrations. They read the snow as if it were a map, the prints of animals like lines of writing guiding their path. They stored fat and marrow in skin pouches, crafted needles from bone to stitch clothing tight, and passed down survival knowledge with the urgency of breath itself. This was not a barren wasteland, though it may seem so to us. It was an ecosystem rich and complex. The grasses of the steppe fed reindeer, the reindeer fed wolves, the wolves tested humans, and humans in turn reshaped the balance through fire and cunning. Everything was in motion. Everything was locked in the struggle to live. The child's short life unfolded against this immense backdrop. Her people were not the only species to raise young here. Mammoth calves stumbled beside their mothers. Lion cubs muled in the safety of caves. Wolf pups fought for milk in the shadows of dens. All across the tundra, life was fragile, precarious, and fierce. And so the frozen child is not just a human story. She is part of this greater web. Her brief heartbeat existed alongside the trumpeting of mammoths, the howls of wolves, the thunder of reindeer. She lived, however briefly, in a world of giants. A world that no longer exists, yet feels alive when we imagine her within it. It is easy to romanticize such a place, to see only the beauty of auroras and the grandeur of megafauna. But to her family, it was constant tension. Every day was a negotiation with death. The cold pressed in, predators circled, hunger gnawed. In such a landscape, the birth of a child was both miracle and risk. And that is what makes her survival, even for a handful of months, extraordinary. She did not live in a sheltered age. She lived in a time when every child was born into uncertainty, when the world was as likely to kill as to nurture. Yet her people fought for her life, carried her through the storms, wrapped her in furs, fed her from scarce stores. We know this because the Ice Age was not kind to the unprotected. Infants without care did not survive. That she reached months at all is a testament not only to her resilience, but to the love of those around her. Even in a world of giants, tenderness endured. This was her world, vast, dangerous, beautiful. A place where life was both fleeting and magnificent, where every moment was bought against the odds. And it was into this world that she opened her eyes for the first, and last, time. Every birth in the Ice Age was a gamble. For the mothers of the steppe, labor was not only a passage of pain and hope, but a confrontation with death itself. For the newborn, the first breath was already a test, lungs filling against air so cold it could burn, a tiny cry carried into a night where predators might be listening. And yet, even here, in a world of hunger and storm, new life emerged. The frozen child was one of those fragile flames. Picture the moment of her arrival. A circle of women gathered close, their breath misting in the dim light of fire, their hands steady from generations of practice. A mother, exhausted and trembling, leaning back on furs, straining with the final push. The father, perhaps outside the shelter, pacing anxious, his heart caught between terror and anticipation. Around them, the cold pressed against the walls of hides and bone, but inside the small circle the air was warm with sweat, fire, and the raw electricity of birth. When she entered the world, she would have been wiped gently with hides, wrapped quickly in fur to keep the night from stealing her warmth. Her cries would have been greeted not as noise, but as music, proof that she had survived the first threshold. In that instant, she was not a symbol of fragility, but of triumph. For a tribe fighting the odds every single day, a child's birth was victory itself. To her mother, she was everything. In the Ice Age, mothers bore the double weight of survival. Their bodies nourished new life through pregnancy, often while still hunting, gathering, or moving camp. Then, once the child was born, their milk became the sole line between life and death. Every calorie the mother ate was measured again in the tiny body at her breast. If food was scarce, it was she who weakened first, giving what little she had to sustain her child. This is the world the frozen child was born into: firelight and exhaustion, love and peril, frost outside and warmth within. Her tribe had no hospitals, no medicines beyond herbs, no steel tools to cut or heal. And yet they had knowledge. Generations of women had guided babies into the world before her. Generations of hands had wrapped umbilical cords, soothed fevers, calmed mothers through pain. She was not the first, nor would she be the last. She was part of an unbroken chain of births that stretched deep into the past. But not every child survived that first night. For some, the breath was too weak, the cold too swift. Many were born into silence, never crying at all. To survive her first hours was no small feat. It meant that her lungs, her heart, her tiny body had managed to endure against odds that often crushed life before it even began. The cradle of her early days was not wood or woven reeds, but arms, her mother's chest, her father's hands, the circle of kin who rocked her close to the fire. To set her down alone would have been unthinkable. In a world where warmth was the difference between life and death, touch was not luxury, it was necessity. Even so, danger never slept. The fire might dim if the tribe could not gather enough wood. A predator's cry might ripple through the camp. A sudden fever might spread in the night. The child's survival was measured not in years, but in hours, days, weeks, each one fought for, each one uncertain. And yet, despite all this, she was cherished. Archaeology shows us that even in the harshest conditions, prehistoric people cared deeply for their young. Infants were buried with beads, ochre, and careful placement, signs of ritual and tenderness. These were not mere extensions of survival strategy, they were individuals, loved and grieved. The frozen child was no exception. She may have lived less than a year, but in that time she became the center of her mother's world, the spark of hope for her tribe, the fragile promise of a future. She was born into fire and frost, two forces locked in constant tension. Fire was her shelter, its glow drying skins, softening meat, and keeping shadows at bay. Frost was her enemy, creeping through gaps in hides, numbing her limbs, threatening to still her breath. Her life balanced between these two elements. Each night the fire burned was another night she lived. Each time the frost advanced, her future dimmed. In this fragile dance, her mother played the central role. Prehistoric mothers carried not only children, but culture itself. In the songs they sang, in the comfort they offered, in the words whispered to infants as they drifted into sleep, knowledge and identity were passed on. Even if the frozen child was too young to understand, she was already being woven into the fabric of her people's story. Every smile she sparked, every cry that summoned her mother's arms, was part of the human thread. Every hour she survived mattered. And though she would not live long enough to speak or walk, her birth still meant something immense. She existed. She was carried. She was loved. The Ice Age was vast and merciless. But in the glow of a small fire on the night of her birth, all of that receded. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was her breath, her cry, the fragile heartbeat of a life that had dared to begin. And for a brief, shining time, she endured. To understand the child, we must look beyond her small, fragile body and into the web of people who surrounded her. She was not born into isolation. She was born into a band of hunters and gatherers, whose survival depended not only on skill and strength, but on one another. In the Ice Age, the tribe was everything. Imagine her world not as an empty wilderness, but as a circle of faces around the fire, men and women, elders and children, hunters, gatherers, storytellers, each carrying knowledge, each holding responsibility. A child was never only the child of her parents. She belonged to the group. Every pair of arms might carry her, every voice might soothe her, every heart might be invested in her fragile survival. Anthropology tells us that hunter-gatherer societies practiced what we call alloparenting, shared parenting. This means that infants were not raised by mothers alone. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated women often nursed and protected babies. Fathers and men, too, carried them, played with them, taught them the sounds of the world. In such a harsh environment, this sharing of care was not sentimental, it was essential. A single caregiver could not always guarantee survival. A network could. So when the frozen child was born, her presence would have touched everyone. For her mother, she was flesh of her flesh. For her father, she was proof of his line continuing. For the elders, she was renewal, another chance for their people to endure against the ice. For siblings, she was both burden and joy, a competitor for food, but also a spark of play and love. Infants reshaped the rhythms of life. A hunt might be delayed because a baby was ill. A migration might pause because mothers needed time to recover from birth. Fires might burn longer into the night because cries needed to be soothed. In this way, even before they could walk or speak, children influenced decisions, tethering the actions of the group to their survival. The tribe was not only a machine of survival, but a family. They laughed, they argued, they teased, they mourned. They passed long nights telling stories, stories that carried the memory of ancestors and the wisdom of past hunts. Around the fire, myths were spoken, knowledge was sung, and children were the audience as much as the reason. For what is the point of knowledge, if not to pass it to the next generation? Infants were, in a sense, the tribe's future made visible. They were fragile, yes, but they were also the proof that the group still had purpose, still had tomorrow. In a world where mortality was constant, where winters claimed lives and predators left bones scattered, children were symbols of defiance. Each birth was the tribe saying to the Ice Age, "We are still here." The frozen child, even in her brief life, played this role. Her presence would have lightened hearts around the fire, if only for a time. Her laughter, small, bubbling, unrecorded, would have been enough to remind the group of what they were fighting for. And when she cried, the sound would not have been an irritation but a signal, a call that someone must feed her, hold her, soothe her. Her needs tied the group together. She was a demand, but also a bond. In answering her, they reaffirmed their humanity. It is tempting to think of prehistoric people as hard, emotionless survivors. But archaeology tells us otherwise. We find burials filled with care, tools made for children, traces of play in the dirt. We see that grief was real, that love was powerful, that communities were not only practical alliances but emotional webs. The frozen child's tribe would have loved her, not abstractly, not metaphorically, but in the raw, human ways we still recognize today. Imagine an elder, wrinkled and weary, holding her tiny body and humming a tune remembered from long ago. Imagine an older brother crouching to tickle her cheek, laughing when she grasped his finger. Imagine her mother, exhausted from gathering wood, leaning down to kiss her forehead before sleep. None of this is fantasy, it is the timeless rhythm of humanity. She was their heart, beating softly against the vast silence of the steppe. And though her life was short, the way she shaped her people was not. Every child born into such a world reminded the tribe why they endured the storms, why they braved the hunts, why they carried fire across frozen lands. For them, survival was not only about food or shelter. It was about continuity, about making sure that stories were told, that skills were passed on, that songs were remembered. A child was the vessel for all of that. The frozen girl was a promise they fought to keep, a fragile, flickering light in the dark of a relentless world. In this sense, she was more than just one child. She embodied the very purpose of the tribe. They were not only surviving for themselves, but for her, for children like her, for the hope that someone would live beyond them. And so, when we think of her tribe, we should not picture only hunters crouched with spears, or gatherers scraping hides. We should see the tenderness too, the circle of hands passing her gently around the fire, the faces softening at her cries, the shared laughter at her first attempts to smile. The tribe was her beating heart, and she was theirs. Even in a landscape of predators and frost, humanity pulsed here, in this small circle of care. She lived not only in her own body, but in the bonds she wove among them. And when she died, it was not only her mother who grieved, it was the entire group, because to lose a child was not to lose one person, but to lose a piece of the tribe's soul. This is what made her tribe more than survivors. It made them human. The child's first and last home was not a house, not a village, not even a shelter that would outlast a season. Her world was the Ice Age, a land ruled by cold and hunger, a landscape that shaped every breath her tribe took. To understand her life, we must step into that world. Picture the steppe tundra stretching in every direction, a flat, endless sea of grass, browned by frost, punctuated here and there by dwarf shrubs and twisted birches. The horizon is immense, skies stretching gray and low, carrying winds that cut like knives. Snow is not a seasonal visitor, but a constant presence. Even in months of weak summer, the air carries a chill. Nights come long and early, cloaking the land in silence broken only by wolves. This was the stage on which the frozen child lived. Every element of her existence was determined by this merciless setting. The tribe's hunger was not occasional, it was chronic, a constant companion. To eat meant to fight the land itself, to chase herds across miles of frozen plains, to scrape edible roots from the ground, to chew on sinew and marrow when meat was scarce. The Ice Age was a paradox, a land both abundant and barren. Abundant, because great beasts roamed it, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer with antlers spanning wider than a man was tall. These creatures carried within them enough meat, hide, and bone to feed and clothe dozens. But they were not easy gifts. To bring one down demanded unity, risk, and sometimes death. Barren, because the land itself offered so little else. Grains had not yet been cultivated, and farming was unimaginable in such cold. The tribe gathered berries when the sun permitted them to grow, but a child like her would rarely taste sweetness. She would be fed on milk, on chewed-down scraps of meat, on the broth of bones simmered over smoky fires. Even these, scarce as they were, came only if the tribe succeeded in the hunt. And hunger was not the only threat. The predators of the Ice Age were formidable. Packs of wolves prowled the plains, lean and relentless. Cave lions, larger than modern lions, stalked the shadows of rocks. Bears, desperate for fat before hibernation, could ambush the careless. A child had no defense against such forces. She relied entirely on her tribe's vigilance, on the spear tips of the men, on the eyes of the women, on the bark of fire. Yet the greatest predator of all was the cold itself. It seeped into bones, numbed fingers, slowed movement until frostbite claimed flesh. For adults, it was a constant battle. For infants, it was nearly insurmountable. A body so small could not hold heat. Every hour was a fight against hypothermia. Every blanket of hide, every ember of fire, every drop of milk was a shield against the ice pressing endlessly inward. The environment also shaped their rhythm of life. The tribe could not settle permanently. The herds moved, and so must they. Camps were temporary, their shelters made from branches, hides, and bones, efficient but fragile against storms. Each migration was perilous, carrying children across frozen rivers, trudging through waist-deep snow, enduring blizzards with no promise of shelter. These were not rare crises but recurring realities. For the child, the Ice Age was not simply a backdrop. It was the reason her life ended before it truly began. The cold was merciless, and the scarcity of food meant her small body could not grow strong enough to resist it. Hunger weakens, cold finishes what hunger begins. And so, her environment wrote the script of her fate. But we should not imagine this land as only death and suffering. It was also majestic. The aurora may have danced across her sky, curtains of green shimmering above the frozen steppe. Herds of mammoths may have thundered past her camp, their massive forms shaking the ground. Sunlight, when it pierced the clouds, turned the snow into diamonds. Even in its cruelty, the Ice Age carried a strange beauty. For her tribe, this beauty was inseparable from danger. The land was both provider and executioner, giving meat in one moment and taking life in the next. And in this duality, the frozen child's brief existence becomes clearer. She was born into a world that demanded constant struggle, a world where survival itself was an act of defiance. The land of ice and hunger shaped her people, shaped all of us who descend from them. Every hardship endured by her tribe carved resilience into human history. Every cry she made by the fire was an echo against the howling wind, a fragile but unmistakable declaration: we are here despite everything. She was small, she was vulnerable, but she was not alone. Around her, the tribe battled the cold, shared warmth, guarded the fire, and hunted across endless plains. Together, they faced a world vast enough to erase them, and yet they endured. For a time, so did she. In the Ice Age, survival did not rest on strength alone. A man's muscles could not outmatch a mammoth's tusks, nor could a woman's endurance overcome the endless cold. What truly set humans apart were their fragile defenses, fire and shelter. These were not mere conveniences, they were life itself. Without them, no tribe, no child, no memory of humanity could have survived the frozen world. Imagine the first fire of winter crackling in a camp. Its flames are small, its light pale against the immensity of darkness. But within its glow, everything changes. The bitter air is pushed back, the night becomes less absolute, and bodies find warmth where none existed before. Fire was a miracle, but also a necessity. For the frozen child, every hour of her brief life was measured by proximity to that flame. Infants in the Ice Age faced a cruel paradox. Their bodies were fragile, unable to store heat. To keep them alive meant constant vigilance over the fire. Embers were guarded like treasure. Adults would feed them with twigs, branches, dung, and bone, anything that could be coaxed into flame. The tribe's survival was tethered to their ability to keep fire burning, day after day, night after night, with no certainty that wood could always be found. When storms howled, fire was fickle. A single gust could smother it. A single careless moment could reduce it to smoke and ash. To rekindle flame without tinder was no small task. Archaeological traces tell us early humans carried embers between camps, nestled in bark or ash bundles, so the next fire would be easier to ignite. The flame was not just heat, it was continuity. It was tradition, memory, and insurance against death. Now picture the shelters that rose around these fires. They were not houses in any modern sense. They were frames of mammoth bones covered with hides, or lean-tos of branches reinforced with sod. At times, even caves became temporary sanctuaries, though not always safe, for predators also sought them. These shelters were fragile barriers between life and oblivion. The wind whistled through seams, snow crept in through gaps, and no wall could stop the deep cold entirely. But even so, they created zones of survival. Inside, warmth pooled, smoke curled, and voices gathered. Here the child would have been cradled. Here her cries would have mingled with the crackle of fire and the murmur of kin. Her entire universe was the circle of heat carved out by flame and hide. Beyond it lay only silence, ice, and death. Shelters were also more than protection. They were symbols of human will. To take bones from a mammoth and arrange them into an arch, to stitch hides into a wall, to gather branches for a roof, this was an act of defiance. No other creature did such a thing. Wolves endured cold through fur, bears through fat, but humans bent the world to build warmth. In the act of shelter-making lay the seed of civilization. Yet even these defenses were fragile. A shelter could collapse under heavy snow. Fires could fail if fuel ran out. Smoke inhalation could sicken the weak. The Ice Age tested every innovation, stripping away what was weak, rewarding only what endured. Fire and shelter did not erase suffering, they only made survival possible, enough to continue the fight. For the frozen child, these thin defenses mattered most. Her small body could not withstand exposure. Each night she would be wrapped in hides, held close to warmth, shielded from drafts. The tribe's women would feed her, hum to her, rock her as flames glowed faintly in the dark. Their every action was a plea to the fire. Do not die tonight. But fire and shelter could only do so much. The cold outside was relentless, seeping through seams, creeping beneath hides. The child's breath would rise in the air, visible even inside the hut. Frost crystals might gather on the roof above her, shimmering in the weak light. Every dawn, survival was uncertain. Still, fire was not only practical, it was spiritual. To many early humans, flames were alive, dancing, consuming, transforming. They connected the tribe to something greater, something mysterious. Around fires, stories were told, songs sung, myths born. The frozen child, though too young to understand, would have felt this rhythm. The fire's glow was the first light to bathe her eyes, its warmth the first comfort she knew. And shelter was not only physical either, it was emotional. Within its walls, bonds deepened. Families pressed together not only for warmth but for reassurance. The child's cries were soothed by touch, by the murmur of voices, by the nearness of bodies sharing the same fragile space. In that sense, the shelter was more than a wall against weather. It was a womb after birth, a second, communal embrace. When we look back now, we often see the Ice Age as vast and impersonal, endless glaciers, giant beasts, cruel climates. But in truth, life in that world was condensed into the smallest of spaces, the radius of firelight, the circle of shelter. Humanity's survival depended not on conquering the world outside, but on creating pockets of warmth within it. And it was in one such pocket that the frozen child lived and died. Her death reminds us of the limits of these defenses. Fire cannot always win against frost. Shelter cannot always hold back the storm. For her, these human miracles delayed the inevitable, but could not prevent it. She froze before her first birthday, a tiny body wrapped, protected, fought for, and still claimed by cold. Yet in her short existence, we glimpse humanity's greatness. Not in triumph, not in conquest, but in persistence. Fire and shelter were fragile, yes, but they were enough to allow her tribe, and countless others, to endure long enough for us to be here now. Her breath by the fire, her cries within the shelter, are part of the long chain of survival that leads directly to us. And perhaps this is the most important truth. Fire and shelter were never only about survival. They were about connection. Connection to one another, pressed shoulder to shoulder around the flame. Connection to ancestors who first tamed sparks and stitched hides. Connection to the future, to us, who now tell her story. The frozen child did not live to see the storm's end, nor the glacier's retreat. But her people did. They carried fire forward, built shelters stronger and stronger, until warmth was no longer fragile but secure. Her short life, framed by flame and hide, represents the thin line on which all humanity once walked. Life in the Ice Age was not only about fighting the cold, it was about feeding fragile bodies, especially the smallest ones. For an infant, the stakes were even higher. A newborn entered the world not with strength, but with hunger. Every cry was not just a plea for warmth, but for nourishment. In the frozen steppe, food was not always a promise. It was a struggle, one measured in drops of milk and scraps of marrow. The frozen child, like every baby of her time, depended first on her mother's body. Milk was the lifeline, the only food that could sustain her in those first months. Yet milk did not come easily. In a world of constant hunger, the mother herself had to fight for enough calories to produce it. Every bite of meat she ate, every handful of berries she gathered in warmer seasons, every morsel passed to her by the tribe, all of it transformed into the milk that kept her daughter alive. This exchange reveals something profound. The child's survival was not her own achievement, nor even her mother's alone. It was collective. The hunt that fed her mother also fed the child. The shared fire roasted the meat that nourished the tribe and, in turn, nourished the infant. In this way, the frozen child was tied not only to her mother's breast, but to the entire network of human effort, the hunters who risked their lives, the gatherers who searched in silence, the elders who rationed food when it grew scarce. But what happened when milk was not enough? Archaeological evidence suggests Ice Age infants were sometimes fed chewed meat, softened plants, or animal fat as supplements. In desperate times, marrow, the fatty, nutrient-rich tissue hidden inside bones, became a resource even for the youngest. Adults would crack open femurs and tibias with stone tools, sucking out the marrow themselves or feeding tiny portions to children who were weaning. Marrow was not glamorous. It was not plentiful. But it was survival condensed into substance. Picture the frozen child in such a moment. A relative squats by the fire, hammerstone in hand, striking a bone. A sharp crack echoes. Inside is the pale, oily marrow, steaming faintly in the cold. It is scooped out, perhaps chewed and softened, then touched to the baby's lips. For her, it is nourishment she cannot understand, only receive. For her family, it is an act of hope, of determination to give her another day. Food was never casual. Every calorie carried meaning. To feed an infant meant choosing sacrifice. Adults sometimes went without so that the youngest could eat. Archaeological studies of Ice Age bones show signs of malnutrition, stress lines etched into teeth, evidence of bodies tested by hunger. Yet somehow, enough children survived for human lineages to continue. This balancing act, of giving and going without, of feeding children first, was at the heart of human resilience. But food was not just about sustenance, it was about ritual and care. Feeding an infant was an act of intimacy, a moment of touch, comfort, and bonding. The frozen child, though she would not remember, was cradled as she nursed, pressed against skin, rocked with murmured sounds. Her hunger was answered not only with nutrients, but with human closeness. This too was nourishment, though of another kind, the nourishment of connection. We can also imagine the emotional weight of these meals. Every feeding was shadowed by anxiety. Would there be enough tomorrow? Would the hunt succeed? Would the mother's milk flow if her own body grew too weak? The line between thriving and fading was thin. For the frozen child, whose life ended before her first birthday, the answer was clear. At some point, nourishment failed. Whether milk dried up, or food ran out, or illness struck, her body could not be sustained. Still, the fact that she lived as long as she did speaks volumes. Her family must have tried. They must have fought to give her every chance, feeding her milk, marrow, fat, chewed meat. They must have carried her close to fire while rationing scarce resources. Her short survival is a testament not to neglect, but to devotion. Food also bound the child to the larger cycles of the world around her. The mammoth herds, the reindeer migrations, the salmon runs, these great movements dictated what could be eaten and when. Her nourishment depended on the rhythms of animals and seasons she could not know, yet which shaped every beat of her fragile heart. When food was abundant, she grew stronger. When it vanished, she weakened. Her fate was woven into the tapestry of ecosystems far larger than herself. There is also something humbling in the image of marrow, this hidden, fragile resource within bone. To modern eyes, it seems almost desperate, even grim. But to Ice Age humans, it was a miracle, a hidden gift. To feed marrow to a baby was to say, even in the hardest places, life can be found. In that act, there is both practicality and poetry. Today, we feed our infants with bottles, formulas, and stores of food that seem endless. It is hard to imagine a world where a child's next meal might depend on cracking a bone open by firelight. Yet that was reality for most of human history. The frozen child lived in such a world, where every feeding was precarious, and every bite a triumph against hunger. Her death reminds us of the limits of nourishment. Even with milk, even with marrow, not every child survived. Many did not, but some did, enough to ensure we are here. And in those who did, we see the power of food not only as calories, but as a thread linking generations. To feed a child was to invest in the future, a future they could not see, but which we now embody. So when we think of the frozen child, let us remember not only her hunger and her end. Let us also remember the hands that fed her, the bodies that sacrificed for her, the marrow cracked open for her sake. Each of those acts was an affirmation: you matter, you are worth keeping alive. She did not live long, but in those meals, she was cherished. Night in the Ice Age was not gentle. It was a presence heavy and vast, swallowing the steppe in silence and shadow. The cold grew sharper, the darkness deeper, and every sound, the crack of ice, the distant cry of wolves, pressed against the thin circle of firelight. For most of the tribe, night was a time to huddle close, to rest, to let exhaustion claim them for a few short hours. But for a mother with an infant, rest was a luxury she could not afford. The frozen child's mother kept her vigil by the fire. She did not sleep as others did. Her body may have begged for rest after long days of hunger and labor, but her mind remained tethered to the small, fragile form in her arms. Every cough, every whimper, every stir was enough to pull her from drowsiness. She watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, thin breaths fogging faintly in the cold. She reached to adjust the furs, to tuck the child closer to her breast, to place another twig on the fire so the flames would not fade. This was the rhythm of her nights, rocking, feeding, guarding. A mother's vigil was not only against the cold, but against fear itself. In the darkness, danger felt near, predators outside the glow, sickness inside the body she cradled. An infant could die without warning, slipping away in sleep. To guard against that, mothers remained half awake, listening for silence, for stillness that might signal the worst. In a world with no medicine, no certainty, a mother's ears became her only shield. Archaeology cannot show us her thoughts, but it shows us her devotion. Infants found buried with care, wrapped in furs, laid gently in earth, speak of mothers who watched, mothers who loved, mothers who grieved. The frozen child, too, must have been the center of such care. Her short life meant many nights of vigil, many hours of holding her close as the fire dimmed. Her mother bore the weight of exhaustion so that her daughter might live a little longer. We can imagine the intimacy of these nights. The fire crackles. The tribe's breathing fills the shelter, heavy with sleep. And in the shadows, one figure remains awake. She shifts her child from one arm to the other, soothing her with quiet hums or soft clicks of the tongue. These sounds are not language, but they are communication, reassurance, comfort, an ancient song passed down through generations of mothers who held their children in darkness. Yet the vigil was not only tender, it was also painful. To remain awake when the body ached for rest was a form of suffering. Her muscles burned from days of carrying, her eyes stung from smoke and sleeplessness. Sometimes she must have wept quietly, not out of weakness, but out of weariness. In those moments, the fire was both her ally and her enemy. It gave warmth to her child, but demanded constant attention, constant feeding of its own. If it died, they would freeze. And so she fed it as she fed her daughter, sustaining both flames in the night. In her exhaustion, she may have dreamed with open eyes. Mothers in all ages know this, the blurred space where wakefulness and sleep collapse together, where one rocks a child and drifts without drifting. But in the Ice Age, drifting too far could mean disaster. A slip of attention, a moment of deep sleep, and the baby could be exposed to cold, smothered beneath heavy furs, or simply stop breathing. So she fought against the pull of sleep, every night, again and again. This fight was not hers alone. Other women of the tribe may have shared her vigil, taking turns, offering relief. Among hunter-gatherers, childcare was often collective. Aunts, sisters, even grandmothers held infants, rocked them, watched fires. But the primary weight still fell on the mother. Her bond with the child, her ability to feed, made her irreplaceable. And so the sleepless nights became hers to bear, marked into her body with fatigue, carved into her spirit with worry. There is something deeply human in this image. Across millennia, across cultures, the sight of a mother awake at night beside her child remains the same. Even now, in modern homes with cribs and heaters, mothers sit awake in darkened rooms, listening to the breathing of their babies. The frozen child's mother lived tens of thousands of years ago, yet her vigil would be instantly recognizable to mothers today. The setting has changed, the dangers differ, but the essence, the sleepless love, the fragile watch, endures. But what of the ending? For the frozen child, the vigil was not enough. Despite her mother's care, despite the long nights awake, she died. We cannot know the night it happened, but we can imagine the silence that fell when her breathing stopped. Perhaps her mother noticed first, holding her too still child against her chest. Perhaps she shook her gently, whispered, pressed her lips to her skin, waiting for warmth that never returned. In that moment, all the nights of watching, all the sacrifices, all the sleepless hours collapsed into grief. And yet that grief was proof of love. To watch so carefully, to lose so much sleep, was to say, you matter, you are worth guarding. Even though the child died, the vigil itself gave meaning to her life. She was never abandoned, never left alone in the cold. She was seen, held, guarded until her last breath. The mother's vigil also speaks to something larger, the role of care in human survival. In the Ice Age, danger was everywhere, predators, hunger, cold. But what truly sustained humanity was care, the refusal to let the vulnerable be forgotten. The frozen child did not live long, but she was never without care. Her mother's sleepless nights by the fire are part of the same thread that carried humanity forward, the commitment to guard life, even when it is fragile, even when it is fleeting. In the end, we remember not just the child, but the woman who kept watch. She remains unseen in the archaeological record, unnamed in history, yet her vigil echoes across time. In her devotion, we glimpse the essence of humanity, the choice to protect, to nurture, to love, even in a world of darkness. Night in the Ice Age was not gentle. It was a presence heavy and vast, swallowing the steppe in silence and shadow. The cold grew sharper, the darkness deeper, and every sound, the crack of ice, the distant cry of wolves, pressed against the thin circle of firelight. For most of the tribe, night was a time to huddle close, to rest, to let exhaustion claim them for a few short hours. But for a mother with an infant, rest was a luxury she could not afford. The frozen child's mother kept her vigil by the fire. She did not sleep as others did. Her body might have begged for rest after long days of hunger and labor, but her mind remained tethered to the small, fragile form in her arms. Every cough, every whimper, every stir was enough to pull her from drowsiness. She watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, thin breaths fogging faintly in the cold. She reached to adjust the furs, to tuck the child closer to her breast, to place another twig on the fire so the flames would not fade. This was the rhythm of her nights, rocking, feeding, guarding. A mother's vigil was not only against the cold, but against fear itself. In the darkness, danger felt near, predators outside the glow, sickness inside the body she cradled. An infant could die without warning, slipping away in sleep. To guard against that, mothers remained half awake, listening for silence, for stillness that might signal the worst. In a world with no medicine, no certainty, a mother's ears became her only shield. Archaeology cannot show us her thoughts, but it shows us her devotion. Infants found buried with care, wrapped in furs, laid gently in earth, speak of mothers who watched, mothers who loved, mothers who grieved. The frozen child, too, must have been the center of such care. Her short life meant many nights of vigil, many hours of holding her close as the fire dimmed. Her mother bore the weight of exhaustion so that her daughter might live a little longer. We can imagine the intimacy of these nights. The fire crackles. The tribe's breathing fills the shelter, heavy with sleep. And in the shadows, one figure remains awake. She shifts her child from one arm to the other, soothing her with quiet hums or soft clicks of the tongue. These sounds are not language, but they are communication, reassurance, comfort, an ancient song passed down through generations of mothers who held their children in darkness. Yet the vigil was not only tender, it was also painful. To remain awake when the body ached for rest was a form of suffering. Her muscles burned from days of carrying, her eyes stung from smoke and sleeplessness. Sometimes she must have wept quietly, not out of weakness, but out of weariness. In those moments, the fire was both her ally and her enemy. It gave warmth to her child, but demanded constant attention, constant feeding of its own. If it died, they would freeze. And so she fed it as she fed her daughter, sustaining both flames in the night. In her exhaustion, she may have dreamed with open eyes. Mothers in all ages know this, the blurred space where wakefulness and sleep collapse together, where one rocks a child and drifts without drifting. But in the Ice Age, drifting too far could mean disaster. A slip of attention, a moment of deep sleep, and the baby could be exposed to cold, smothered beneath heavy furs, or simply stop breathing. So she fought against the pull of sleep every night, again and again. This fight was not hers alone. Other women of the tribe may have shared her vigil, taking turns, offering relief. Among hunter-gatherers, childcare was often collective. Aunts, sisters, even grandmothers held infants, rocked them, watched fires. But the primary weight still fell on the mother. Her bond with the child, her ability to feed, made her irreplaceable. And so the sleepless nights became hers to bear, marked into her body with fatigue, carved into her spirit with worry. There is something deeply human in this image. Across millennia, across cultures, the sight of a mother awake at night beside her child remains the same. Even now, in modern homes with cribs and heaters, mothers sit awake in darkened rooms, listening to the breathing of their babies. The frozen child's mother lived tens of thousands of years ago, yet her vigil would be instantly recognizable to mothers today. The setting has changed, the dangers differ, but the essence, the sleepless love, the fragile watch, endures. But what of the ending? For the frozen child, the vigil was not enough. Despite her mother's care, despite the long nights awake, she died. We cannot know the night it happened, but we can imagine the silence that fell when her breathing stopped. Perhaps her mother noticed first, holding her too still child against her chest. Perhaps she shook her gently, whispered, pressed her lips to her skin, waiting for warmth that never returned. In that moment, all the nights of watching, all the sacrifices, all the sleepless hours collapsed into grief. And yet that grief was proof of love. To watch so carefully, to lose so much sleep, was to say, you matter, you are worth guarding. Even though the child died, the vigil itself gave meaning to her life. She was never abandoned, never left alone in the cold. She was seen, held, guarded until her last breath. The mother's vigil also speaks to something larger, the role of care in human survival. In the Ice Age, danger was everywhere, predators, hunger, cold. But what truly sustained humanity was care, the refusal to let the vulnerable be forgotten. The frozen child did not live long, but she was never without care. Her mother's sleepless nights by the fire are part of the same thread that carried humanity forward, the commitment to guard life, even when it is fragile, even when it is fleeting. In the end, we remember not just the child, but the woman who kept watch. She remains unseen in the archaeological record, unnamed in history, yet her vigil echoes across time. In her devotion, we glimpse the essence of humanity, the choice to protect, to nurture, to love, even in a world of darkness. In the Ice Age, survival was a visible battle. Humans hunted, they built fires, they endured the cold. Yet some of the greatest threats were invisible. Illness, infection, and disease moved silently through the body, striking without claws or teeth. For an infant, these unseen enemies were often the most dangerous of all. The frozen child may have died not only from cold, but from sickness, a fever that drained her strength, an infection that spread too quickly, or a hidden weakness in her lungs or blood. We cannot know for certain, but the archaeological record tells us that infant mortality in the Ice Age was staggering. Many children never saw their first birthday, and while predators and accidents claimed some, illness claimed countless more. The Ice Age world was harsh, but it was also teeming with microbes. Caves where families huddled together were warm but cramped, filled with smoke and bodies. These shelters protected against cold, but they also became breeding grounds for respiratory infections. A simple cough could sweep through the group. For an adult, it might mean discomfort. For a newborn, it could mean death. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups today find echoes of these struggles. Infants often die from diarrhea, pneumonia, or sepsis, diseases that thrive where sanitation is limited, where water is unsafe, where wounds cannot be sterilized. In the Ice Age, without knowledge of germs, every cut, every sip of river water, every shared breath carried risk. A scratch from a bone, a burn from the fire, or even the cutting of an umbilical cord could open the door to infection. Imagine the frozen child's mother noticing her daughter's breathing grow ragged, her skin hot to the touch, her cries weaker. She would not have words like pneumonia or infection. She would only know that her child was slipping away, taken by something she could not see or fight. She might press herbs to the baby's skin, whisper over her, rock her harder as if movement could shake the sickness free. But the sickness would remain, hidden inside, a battle invisible to human eyes. The terror of illness is its mystery. Ice Age people could predict the coming of winter, track the movements of animals, prepare for storms. But they could not predict when a cough would turn deadly, or why one child lived while another died. Illness was random, cruel, inexplicable. It must have felt like a curse. And because it was invisible, it carried with it an added weight of fear, the fear of the unknown. Archaeology shows us signs of this battle. Tiny skeletons, some with marks of malnutrition, others with lesions hinting at disease. These bones tell stories of children who lived briefly, who fought sickness without understanding. Even adults were not safe. Dental infections, tuberculosis, parasites, all haunted Ice Age communities. Yet the youngest were the most vulnerable, their bodies too small to withstand the storm. What makes this story powerful is its familiarity. Even now, in modern hospitals with advanced medicine, parents watch helplessly as infants fight infections. Even now, the sound of a child coughing at night can make a parent's heart race. We have antibiotics, vaccines, doctors, yet fear remains, rooted deep in our shared past. The frozen child's illness, whatever it was, connects across time to every parent who has prayed for a sick child to survive. The emotional weight of such losses was enormous. Illness did not only kill, it scarred families. Mothers who lost infants might have felt guilt. Had they not held her close enough? Had they not kept the fire strong enough? Had they done something wrong? These feelings, though unspoken, must have been part of their grief. And in small groups, where every life mattered, the death of a child was not just private sorrow but a wound to the entire community. The frozen child story reminds us that survival was never guaranteed. Even when predators were driven away, even when fires were kept alive, even when food was found, invisible enemies remained. A baby could be safe in her mother's arms, yet death could still find her through fever or infection. This uncertainty shaped how Ice Age people saw the world. It taught them to expect loss, to live with grief as a constant companion. And yet, they continued. They kept having children, kept watching over them, kept mourning those they lost. This persistence shows us something about humanity's resilience. Illness was devastating, but it did not stop life. The frozen child died, but others survived. The tribe carried forward, carrying with them the memory of her brief existence. Illness also shaped culture. Some anthropologists believe that rituals, charms, and spiritual practices arose partly from the need to explain sickness. If a child died without cause, perhaps the people said it was the work of spirits, or the punishment of gods, or the presence of unseen forces. These beliefs may have offered comfort, giving shape to what was otherwise senseless. To fight an invisible enemy, people created invisible allies, prayers, chants, offerings. It is here that we glimpse the earliest roots of medicine and religion entwined. A mother might place herbs on her child not only for their possible soothing properties, but also because they carried symbolic power. A shaman might breathe smoke over the baby, believing it would drive out the sickness. These actions, though ineffective by modern standards, were acts of care, acts of resistance against despair. They showed that even in the face of invisible death, people tried to act, to protect, to save. The frozen child's illness, whatever form it took, did not erase her importance. Instead, it reveals to us the fragility of human life in its earliest years. Her death is not just a story of defeat, it is also a story of humanity's determination to face the unknown. In her short life, she bore witness to her mother's devotion, her family's care, their refusal to surrender even when hope was thin. Today, when we look at her remains preserved in the earth, we do not only see a child who lost a battle to invisible enemies. We also see a reminder of what it means to be human, to fight battles we cannot see, to love even when we cannot save, to endure loss and still continue. The child who froze before her first birthday is not only a tragedy, she is also a testament to survival itself. Her story tells us that even in a world haunted by invisible enemies, love remained visible, unshaken, and enduring. There is a silence unlike any other in the world. It is not the silence of snowfall, not the silence of caves, not the silence of sleep. It is the silence that follows the last breath of a child. For the Ice Age mother cradling her daughter, that silence must have been unbearable. The baby who once whimpered, coughed, and cried now lay still in her arms. A cradle that once held life was now only holding absence. The moment of loss is impossible to describe fully, yet it is perhaps the most universal experience across all time. In that instant, the frozen child ceased to be a struggle for survival and became a memory. One heartbeat stopped, and with it, a world collapsed. We imagine her mother holding the child longer than necessary, unwilling to believe, rocking gently though the baby no longer stirred, touching the little lips, hoping for warmth, listening for a breath that would not return. The mother's body must have trembled with disbelief, for she had carried this child inside her, felt her move, birthed her into the cold world, protected her through every night. And now, in a single moment, she was gone. Around her, the tribe might have fallen silent too. Perhaps a fire crackled, but no one spoke. The sound of loss is not only silence, it is also restraint, the swallowing of words, the holding of breath, the heaviness in the air. Some might have averted their eyes, others might have wept quietly. In a small group, the death of a child was not only her mother's grief, it was everyone's grief. Each life was precious, and each loss diminished the whole. The cradle, whether a woven sling, a fur-lined hollow, or simply the curve of a mother's arms, was no longer a vessel for the future. It was now a vessel for the past, for memories too brief, and for a love that had nowhere to go. Love does not end when life ends. It lingers, it burns, it aches. And in the Ice Age, that ache would have been carried not just in the heart, but in every action that followed, the burial, the mourning, the silent meals, the way the mother looked at other children and remembered the one she lost. Anthropologists remind us that death in infancy was tragically common. Yet common does not mean easy. Common does not mean painless. 1,000 mothers before her and 1,000 after experienced the same silence. But for each one it was unique. It was personal. It was devastating. We can only speculate about what the tribe believed in that moment. Did they see the child's death as a passage, a return to the earth, a journey to a spirit world? Did they tell themselves she had become one with the ancestors, watching over them from another plane? Or did they see only finality, a flame snuffed out too soon? Whatever they believed, grief does not yield easily to reason. The pain was real. The absence, permanent. For the mother, the silence may have been unbearable precisely because her entire being was built around protecting this child. A parent in the Ice Age did not have distractions, did not place a child in a crib while life carried on elsewhere. The baby was always close, carried during foraging, fed on demand, warmed with body heat through every night. When that closeness was broken by death, it must have felt like part of the mother's own body had been torn away. We know from archaeological finds that infants were sometimes buried with beads, shells, or other small tokens. These were not functional objects. They were gestures of love, symbols of remembrance. In death as in life, the child was cared for, adorned, given meaning. Even in the bleakest times, humans chose to act with tenderness. Perhaps the frozen child, after her final silence, was placed on furs, wrapped carefully, and buried with a keepsake. Perhaps her mother tucked something beside her, a bead, a feather, or even just a strand of her own hair. In the silence after loss, ritual may have been the only way to make sense of the unbearable. Ritual gave the tribe a framework, a way to transform raw grief into action. Digging the grave, choosing the place, speaking words, or simply sitting together, allowed them to carry the silence without being crushed by it. But still, the moment itself cannot be softened entirely. The instant when a mother realizes her child has taken her last breath is sharp, cutting, unforgettable. That moment likely replayed in her memory again and again, just as it does for grieving parents today. She would have remembered the child's final cry, or the last time she fed, or the last time her tiny fingers gripped hers. These details, too small for history to record, were enormous to her. The silence of the cradle extended beyond that night. It echoed into the following days, when the mother's body still produced milk but the baby was gone. When she saw other mothers nursing. When she saw older children playing. When she felt the hollow weight in her arms. Grief is not a single moment. It is a present stretching forward. And in the Ice Age, when life was already a struggle, grief made survival even harder. And yet, the silence also carried something else. In its weight, it demanded memory. The frozen child would not be forgotten, even if she lived less than a year. Her story, her brief existence, was etched into the hearts of her family. Every time her mother saw the sky, the snow, the fire, she might have thought of her. Every time she held another child, she might have remembered the one who was lost. That is what makes the frozen child's silence so haunting today. Thousands of years later, we still hear it. We cannot hear her cries, her breaths, her laughter, but we feel the silence she left behind. It speaks across millennia, telling us not only of death but of love. In the end, the cradle was silent. But silence is not emptiness. It is the echo of what was once there. The frozen child's silence, like the silence of countless children across prehistory, is heavy because it was once filled with sound, with the promise of a life that might have been. And in that silence we find the heart of her story, not just a tragedy of death, but a testament to the depth of human love, grief, and endurance. The ground was hard. The earth was frozen. Yet still, they dug. The act of burial in the Ice Age was never simple, never easy. It demanded effort, strength, and patience, qualities already stretched thin in a world of hunger and cold. And yet, when the child died, the tribe made space for her beneath the frost. This act alone tells us everything. She mattered. Her short life, though brief, was deemed worthy of effort, worthy of memory, worthy of a place in the earth. We imagine the scene, figures crouched in the cold, breaking through frozen soil with stone tools and antler picks. Each strike echoed not only with the sound of labor but with the weight of mourning. Digging a grave in the Ice Age was not only physical, it was emotional. With each handful of soil removed, the tribe was preparing to let go. The choice of burial site may have carried meaning. Perhaps they chose a place near water, where the sound of a river would always flow. Perhaps beneath a tree, where roots reached downward as if to embrace. Or maybe in a sheltered hollow, protected from the winds, where snow would cover gently in winter. In any case, the choice itself was a statement. This child would rest here among them, and the land would hold her story. When archaeologists uncover Ice Age burials, they often find more than bones. They find beads, ochre, shells, carvings. These are not tools of survival. They are symbols. They are love transformed into objects. A baby buried with beads tells us that her family took the time, in the midst of survival, to adorn her for her journey. A mother might have strung shells together, each one carefully selected. A father might have placed a tool beside her, as if to protect her. These were acts not of necessity but of devotion. We cannot know exactly what the frozen child was buried with, but we can imagine. Perhaps her mother clipped a small lock of her own hair and laid it in the grave. Perhaps a sibling placed a pebble or a feather, something of theirs, something given. Humans, even in deep prehistory, sought to give meaning to death. They could not save her life, but they could give her story a resting place. The burial itself was more than an ending. It was a bridge. To place a child beneath the frost was to connect her with the earth and with the future. Her tiny body became part of the land, part of the cycles of soil, stone, and snow. To those who buried her, perhaps this was not only loss but also return. A return to the ancestors. A return to the world that birthed all life. Some anthropologists argue that ritual burials marked a turning point in human thought. To bury is to believe that death is not merely disposal but passage. It is to say that life matters, even after it ends. And here in the Ice Age, with so little to spare, they still chose ritual. They still chose to honor. That choice tells us that humans had already begun to weave meaning into the fabric of survival. We might imagine how the burial unfolded, the child wrapped carefully in furs, her tiny body preserved as gently as possible. Perhaps red ochre was sprinkled, staining the soil with the color of blood, symbolizing life even in death. Perhaps words were spoken, not words as we know them, but murmured sounds, chants, or cries that carried emotion more than language. Grief needed a voice, and ritual gave it form. And then the final moment, the placing of the child into the earth. For the mother, this must have been unbearable, lowering her daughter into a space from which she would not return. She may have touched her one last time, smoothed her hair, kissed her forehead. These gestures, universal across cultures and time, connect us directly to her. They remind us that grief, though ancient, is still the same. Once the child was placed, the soil returned. Each handful of earth was both an act of concealment and of remembrance. The grave closed slowly until only a mound or a mark remained. Snow might have fallen, covering it in white, making the earth appear untouched again. Yet beneath it lay not only a body, but a story, a bond, a love. For the tribe, the burial marked a transition. Before it, grief was raw, chaotic, unformed. After it, grief could settle into memory. Ritual does not erase pain, but it shapes it. It gives it a place to rest. In that way, burial was as much for the living as for the dead. And what of the child herself? In her burial, she became something larger than her short life. She became part of the community's memory, carried forward through story and presence. Each time someone passed the grave, they might have remembered. Each winter, as snow covered the ground, the mother might have looked to that place and thought of her. The burial was not the end of the child's existence. It was the beginning of her memory. Today, when archaeologists uncover Ice Age graves, they often pause with reverence. Even in the scientific act of excavation, there is recognition of something deeper. These are not just remains. They are stories frozen in time. The beads, the ochre, the arrangement of bones, each detail speaks of love. Each grave is a whisper from the past saying, "This person mattered. This child mattered." And so we return to the frozen child's burial. We may never find her grave. We may never see the beads, or the soil, or the place where she lay. But we know with certainty that she was mourned. She was honored. She was loved. And the act of her burial beneath the frost ensures that her brief life still echoes across thousands of years. In that cold earth, covered by snow and silence, the tribe left behind more than a body. They left behind proof of humanity itself. The burial was over. The soil had been replaced. The mound had been smoothed. Snow had begun to fall again, as if the earth itself was determined to cover the wound. For a moment, silence lingered. The mother's eyes remained fixed on the spot where her child now lay. Her hands were still. Her body was heavy with grief. But the world did not pause. The cold wind blew. Hunger gnawed. The tribe had to move. This is one of the harshest truths of Ice Age life. Grief could never be endless. Survival demanded motion. The tribe could not stay beside the grave forever, no matter how much they wanted to. They had to keep searching, for food, for shelter, for safety. Death was a moment, but life was a constant struggle. And so the very next day, perhaps even the very next hour, the tribe began to walk again. For the mother, this must have been a kind of second death. To leave the grave behind was to accept that she could not protect her child anymore. She had given her to the earth, and now she had to give herself back to the living. She had to walk, even as her body longed to stay. She had to carry her grief inside, silent and invisible, as her feet pressed forward on the frozen ground. We must imagine the duality of that moment. On one side, grief. On the other, survival. Each step forward was not a forgetting but a negotiation. How does one carry loss and hunger at the same time? How does one mourn and hunt, cry and gather, ache and walk? The Ice Age demanded both. It demanded resilience, not as a choice but as a law of existence. The tribe itself had to adapt to her grief. Some may have avoided speaking of the child, fearful of opening wounds too deep. Others may have offered small comforts, a hand on her shoulder, a piece of food shared without words. Community was survival, but it was also solace. To live in a group meant that even grief was carried together. And yet, we must also acknowledge the possibility of silence. In many harsh environments, grief is not spoken, because words cannot be spared. Perhaps no one mentioned the child again, not because they did not care, but because they did not know how to hold both mourning and survival in the same breath. For the mother, that silence could have been heavy, a constant reminder that her sorrow was hers alone. As the tribe moved on, the landscape changed. The wind carried them across plains of snow, through forests rimmed with ice, past rivers that cracked with frost. Each step away from the grave was also a step into the unknown. Did the mother glance back one last time at the place where her child lay? Did she whisper a promise under her breath that she would not forget? We can imagine her turning once, then twice, before the distance swallowed the mound, leaving only memory. This act of leaving is something deeply human. Even today, when we bury our dead, we must eventually walk away from the grave. The hardest part is not the burial itself. It is the living afterward. The tribe's footsteps fading into the snowy distance mirrored a truth we still know. Life insists on moving forward, even when hearts remain behind. But moving on did not mean forgetting. The child's absence was now part of the tribe's story. Around fires at night, when silence grew heavy, perhaps her name was whispered. Perhaps the mother kept a small token, a bead, a shell, a scrap of cloth, as a reminder. In this way, the child traveled with them, not in body but in memory. For the children who survived, the death of their sister may have taught them something unspoken. In the Ice Age, lessons were often silent, carried in experience rather than words. They learned that life was fragile. They learned that love was fleeting. They learned that tomorrow was never promised. These lessons, though heavy, were the backbone of resilience. And so the tribe continued, step by step, across the frozen world. They hunted, they gathered, they fought hunger and cold. The mother, though heavy with sorrow, also kept moving. Perhaps in time, her body healed. Perhaps she bore another child, carrying both the ache of loss and the hope of new life. This cycle, death followed by life, grief followed by resilience, was not an exception in the Ice Age. It was the rhythm of existence. From an anthropological view, the ability to move on after loss may have been one of humanity's greatest strengths. To survive, humans had to carry sorrow without being crushed by it. They had to mourn without stopping. They had to endure emotional pain while still focusing on practical needs. This emotional flexibility, this capacity to walk forward despite grief, may have been as important as fire, tools, or language in ensuring human survival. Yet we must also remember the tenderness. Moving on was not coldness. It was not forgetting. It was love transformed into endurance. For the mother, every step was heavy with her daughter's absence. But perhaps she thought of her child as she walked. Perhaps, in her mind, each step was also a way of carrying her, a way of saying, I live, and in my living you remain. This duality, grief and resilience, is not only the story of one tribe. It is the story of humanity itself. Again and again across millennia, we have buried our dead and moved on. We have carried sorrow across continents, across generations, across centuries. We have learned to keep walking. The frozen child's tribe was one of the earliest examples of this truth, but it echoes still in every family that has ever buried a loved one and returned to life the next day. The frozen earth closed over the child. The snow covered her grave. The wind erased the footprints of the mourners. But the tribe did not vanish. They walked on into the horizon, carrying memory in silence, carrying grief in their hearts, carrying life forward despite death. In this way, the child who froze before her first birthday was not left behind. She was with them, in their silence, in their resilience, in their endurance. She was gone, yet she remained. And so the tribe moved on. Grief in the Ice Age had no language. There were no therapists, no journals, no written words to pour emotions into. It was silent. It lived in the body, in the muscles, in the eyes that could not close without seeing what was gone. For the mother who buried her child, grief became a second skin, invisible to the tribe, but felt in every breath she took. Her days did not allow for mourning in the way we think of it. The Ice Age was relentless. Food still had to be gathered. Fires still had to be tended. Snares had to be checked. Water had to be fetched. Her hands kept moving, because if they stopped, she too could vanish. Yet beneath those motions, grief pressed heavy against her chest, like a stone she could not put down. We must imagine her in the small, quiet moments, when the fire dimmed low and the tribe fell into silence, when the children, tired from walking, curled against each other to sleep. In those still hours, her body must have remembered the absence most acutely. Her arms, once used to holding her child, now had nothing to cradle. Her breasts, perhaps still producing milk, ached with emptiness. Her body itself betrayed her, prepared for a life that was no longer there. There is something unbearably human in that detail. Biology does not immediately adjust to loss. Her body might have leaked milk into the cold air, a cruel reminder that nature had prepared her to feed, to nurture, to protect, only to have that purpose stolen away. Such physical reminders deepened the ache, transforming grief from thought into sensation. Silence was her companion. Among the tribe, perhaps she did not speak of the child. Words may have been scarce, reserved for the immediate needs of survival. But silence does not mean forgetting. Silence is often the deepest form of remembrance. As she walked behind the others, her mind may have replayed the child's short life, her birth, her first cry, her fragile breaths. Memories so few, yet each carved deep. It is tempting for us to imagine grief as loud. But in the Ice Age, it was quiet. There was no place for wailing endlessly, no room for stopping the world to mourn. The landscape itself demanded silence. Grief was carried like breath, unseen, constant, necessary, unspoken. The mother's grief would not have been only sorrow. It would have been entangled with guilt. In harsh conditions, the loss of a child could feel like failure. Had she not kept her warm enough? Had she not fed her enough? Had she chosen the wrong moment to rest, the wrong path to walk, the wrong time to stop? These unanswerable questions could have tormented her in silence. Guilt is as old as grief. And yet, in the same silence, there may have been moments of tenderness. Perhaps as she walked through snow, she imagined the child's spirit close by, carried in the wind or resting among the stars. Perhaps she whispered to her when no one could hear. Perhaps she made a promise, "You are gone, but I will not forget you." These small private rituals, invisible to archaeology, inaudible to anthropology, were as real as any burial mound. Grief may also have reshaped her place in the tribe. Others might have watched her carefully, concerned that sorrow could drain her strength. Or perhaps, by surviving such loss, she was seen as stronger, carrying wisdom forged in pain. In small communities, personal grief was never entirely personal. It rippled outward, shaping relationships, shifting dynamics, altering the emotional balance of the group. But mostly, grief lived within her. In her eyes, which may have seemed older than her years. In her hands, which trembled slightly as she wove fibers or scraped hides. In her gait, slower than before, as if the weight of absence pressed against every step. In these subtle ways, her grief became part of her identity, not a thing she could shed, but a shadow that would always follow her. We can imagine her years later, perhaps with new children, still carrying the memory of the one who froze before her first birthday. Each new child may have been both comfort and ache, a chance to nurture again, but also a reminder of what was lost. Grief does not vanish with time, it transforms, weaving itself into new loves, new bonds, new hopes. It becomes quieter, but it does not disappear. From an anthropological perspective, grief such as hers is one of the most profound markers of humanity. Animals mourn, yes, but humans carry grief forward long after the practical moment has passed. We hold memory. We replay loss. We allow absence to shape us. This is one of the paradoxes of human survival. The very capacity to love deeply, which ensured cooperation and care, also ensured that when loss came, it cut deeply. Her grief was not weakness. It was the shadow side of love. Her silence, then, was not emptiness. It was depth. It was the way she honored her child without words, the way she bore sorrow while still walking forward. In her silence, grief was not forgotten. It was preserved. And perhaps this is why, thousands of years later, we can still feel her presence. We do not know her name. We do not know the sound of her voice. But we know grief, and through that knowing, we can imagine hers. Her silence echoes across time, a reminder that grief is as old as humanity itself, as universal as hunger, as enduring as survival. The child froze before her first birthday. The tribe moved on. The snow fell, and the world turned. But the mother's grief remained, silent and steady, as much a part of her as her heartbeat. It did not fade. It did not vanish. It became the thread she carried into every day that followed, a thread of sorrow woven into the fabric of survival. In that silence, we meet her most fully. Not in the burial, not in the ritual, but in the quiet ache she carried, in the tears that may have frozen on her cheeks as she sat beside a fire. In that silence, she is most human. In that silence, she is most alive. And in that silence, her child still lived, not in body, but in memory, in sorrow, in the invisible weight the mother bore across the frozen world. Children in the Ice Age did not live in a world sheltered from reality. They saw blood when animals were butchered. They felt hunger when food was scarce. They shivered when fires went out. And when death came, they saw it too. There were no walls to separate them, no soft words to disguise what had happened. Death was part of the landscape, as obvious as snow, as permanent as the mountains. The freezing of the infant was not hidden from them. They had seen her small body grow weaker in the final days, the color draining from her skin, the cries becoming fewer, quieter, until they stopped altogether. They had seen their mother's arms fall empty. They had seen the burial, the digging into frozen soil, the laying down of the tiny form, the covering with earth. It became one of their earliest lessons, not taught in words but absorbed through watching. We must imagine their young minds struggling to grasp what this meant. A child may have asked, "Where did she go?" But answers would not have been clear. In a world before philosophy, before theology, before written myths, death was explained in fragments, in gestures, in metaphor. Perhaps an elder pointed at the sky and said she was with the stars. Perhaps someone touched their own chest and said her breath had gone away. The words may have been few, but the meaning lingered. What mattered more than explanation was the atmosphere around them. They watched how adults moved, slower, quieter, more careful. They saw their mother's silence, her absence of laughter. They noticed how the tribe avoided speaking the child's name, or perhaps whispered it only at the fire. In these small cues, the surviving children learned something profound, that life was fragile, that absence could hurt, that bonds could be broken by forces beyond control. And yet children are resilient. Even in grief, they played. They chased one another across the snow, they laughed when embers sparked unexpectedly, they invented small games with sticks and stones. But beneath this play, something new had been planted in their minds, an awareness of limits. The tribe's children had learned that the world could take away without warning. That lesson would never leave them. It shaped how they grew. When they saw a new infant born months or years later, perhaps they looked differently, with a protectiveness beyond their age. When they saw someone shivering in the cold, they knew what it could mean. They became cautious, attentive, wiser earlier than children in gentler times. Death did not only remove, it also taught. We can imagine one of the older siblings, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, staring into the burial mound long after the adults had walked away. The memory of that small form under the earth would be etched into them. Years later, as an adult, they might return to that place, remembering not only their sibling but the day they first understood mortality. Memory in children is sticky, and grief imprints deeply. Archaeology sometimes reveals children's graves surrounded by objects, beads, shells, toys of bone or carved antlers. These offerings were not just for the dead, they were also for the living. When children saw their parents place precious items beside the body, they learned that the dead still mattered. That love did not stop with the last breath. That remembrance was as important as survival. Such rituals gave children a framework. Death was final, but memory could be carried. We must consider how this shaped their identities. Children who grew up with death close at hand became adults who knew that every choice mattered. To waste food, to neglect fire, to ignore sickness. These were not small mistakes. They could mean the difference between life and death. The loss of their sibling was not just personal sorrow. It was a lesson in vigilance, in attentiveness, in care. But there is a deeper layer too, the way grief humanizes. For the surviving children, the death of their sibling deepened empathy. They had felt absence. They had seen sorrow on their mother's face. They had known silence in the campfire circle. This early encounter with grief made them capable of understanding others' pain later. It planted within them the seeds of compassion, one of humanity's greatest strengths. Not every lesson was tender. Some were harsh. In moments of hunger or danger, a child might have overheard an elder mutter that survival comes first, that not all can be saved. Such words may have stung, but they carried their own truth. The world was unforgiving, and choices were cruel. Children who heard them learned that love and brutality lived side by side. That to endure, one sometimes had to accept the unbearable. Still, children are inheritors of memory. They do not only observe, they carry forward. Years later, they may have told stories of the sister who died in the cold before her first birthday. Even if those stories were only fragments, a name, a gesture, a whispered mention by the fire, they kept her alive in the collective memory of the tribe. In this way, the dead child became part of the identity of the living. We know from anthropological studies that death in small tribes often became a moral lesson. Children were taught to care for each other because they had seen what neglect or misfortune could cost. They were told to respect the forces of nature because they had seen how quickly it could take life away. These were not abstract philosophies, they were lived truths, carried in memory. Imagine the child's siblings decades later, adults now with their own children. Around the fire, they may have told them, "I once had a sister who died before she could speak, before she could walk." That story, short as it was, became a thread in the fabric of their lineage. The dead child, though absent, shaped generations she would never see. The children of the tribe learned because they could not avoid learning. The Ice Age was a teacher that spared no one. Through play and sorrow, through silence and ritual, they absorbed the most fundamental truth, that life was fragile, and because it was fragile, it was precious. The child who froze before her first birthday did not only teach through her death. She taught through the lives that continued around her, through the children who watched, remembered, and carried her memory forward into the long story of humanity. When words were scarce, objects spoke. In the deep cold of the Ice Age, memory was not always preserved in sentences or stories. It was preserved in marks scratched into bone, in beads strung together, in ochre smeared onto stone. The dead child who never reached her first birthday may not have been remembered in a long oral history, but she may have been remembered in an object, small, simple, but enduring. Archaeologists uncover such traces across Europe and Asia, a baby's grave lined with shells, a tiny body placed on a bed of red ochre, a necklace of animal teeth encircling an infant's remains. To us, these are artifacts. To them, they were gestures of love. A parent's hand had strung those beads. A sibling may have collected those shells. A tribe had given up precious ochre, using it not for the decoration of living bodies but for the one who could no longer breathe. What does it mean to carve memory into matter? For a people without writing, it meant fixing grief into something that would last longer than breath. A child's name could be forgotten after 2 generations. But a bead, a pendant, a carving, those could endure for centuries. The tribe may not have thought in such long scales of time, but instinctively they understood. Matter holds what memory alone cannot. We can imagine, then, the family of the frozen child creating some token. Perhaps her mother scratched a mark into a piece of mammoth ivory. Perhaps her father placed a carved flint blade beside her, too large for her tiny hands, but symbolic of the life she never lived. Perhaps an elder tied a cord of sinew, a knot meant to bind memory. The object itself is lost to us, but the impulse, to mark, to remember, was almost universal. Bone and stone became more than tools. They became vessels of feeling. When someone shaped a figurine or carved a line, it was not only art, it was a memory externalized. We know this from burials where objects appear unnecessary for survival but necessary for meaning. A baby does not need beads. The dead do not need ochre. Yet people gave them anyway. This is how memory became material. It is haunting to think that some of the earliest art in human history may have been born from grief. Before there were cave paintings of bison and horses, there may have been scratches made for the dead. The urge to preserve life through symbols may have begun with loss. The child who froze before her first birthday did not leave words, but perhaps she left a symbol, carved by hands that loved her. We might picture a carved figurine, small, smooth, made from mammoth ivory. Its form could be abstract, perhaps just a curve suggesting a child's body. It would not survive the millennia unless buried deep, yet such things did exist. The famous Venus figurines found across Ice Age Europe, though not tied to a specific individual, show us that people invested hours of labor into shaping ivory into human forms. Why? Because form mattered. Shape carried memory. Stone, too, could bear the weight of remembrance. A simple mark repeated, a circle scratched into rock near a burial, a tally of lines, one less than the number of children alive. We do not know what these symbols meant, but we know they meant something, because they were deliberate. In the harshness of survival, no one wasted energy on pointless gestures. Carving took time. Ochre was scarce. Every mark carried intention. Memory was also worn on the body. Imagine the mother carrying a bead that once hung at her daughter's burial. She might wear it on a cord around her neck, touching it in moments of silence. In this way, the child remained close not only in thought but in matter. Anthropologists have found evidence of such practices, personal ornaments tied to grief, passed through generations. A bead could become an heirloom, carrying the weight of a lost life. This act of material memory created something profound. It made the dead visible even to those who never knew them. A child born years later might see the bead around their mother's neck and ask, "Whose was that?" And in the answer, however brief, the memory lived again. The object became a bridge across time, extending the child's presence beyond her brief span of days. Stone and bone also gave permanence against the elements. Flesh decayed, breath vanished, but ivory and ochre could last. In this way, people resisted the oblivion of nature. The Ice Age erased footprints quickly. It devoured bodies in snow and soil. But a carved bone, a polished tooth, a painted stone, these could outlast the cold. Memory became durable because matter was durable. There is something profoundly human about this. Animals grieve, as we know from elephants or primates who linger over their dead. But only humans carve grief into artifacts. Only humans make loss into art. The child who froze before her first birthday may never have known her tribe's traditions. Yet she inspired them to create, to externalize their pain, to hold on when time threatened to take everything away. We, thousands of years later, are the beneficiaries of this impulse. Every time archaeologists unearth an infant's grave, every time they find beads, ochre, carvings, they are not just studying rituals. They are witnessing love made tangible. They are looking at memory turned into matter. They are holding in their hands the continuation of a life that ended too soon. And so the frozen child is not only a story of sorrow. She is also a story of creativity, of how grief pressed people to invent symbols, to leave marks, to craft objects that whispered across generations. Through stone and bone, her brief life reached further than her breath ever could. Before there were languages, there were sounds. Before there were words to describe love or loss, there were tones, hums, sighs, and cries. When the child froze before her first birthday, her tribe may not have had elaborate vocabulary for grief or sorrow, but they had voices, they had breath, they had the human impulse to pour emotion into sound. And in that impulse, we glimpse the earliest songs of mourning. Imagine the mother holding her child's still body. At first, there is silence, a shock so deep that breath itself feels impossible. Then, inevitably, the silence breaks. A sob escapes. A moan follows. The tribe gathers, and with them come other sounds, not words, but vibrations of solidarity, a low hum, a rhythm of sighs, a keening that rises and falls like wind over the tundra. These are not organized songs as we think of them, but they are the seeds of music. Anthropologists believe music may have originated in such moments: lullabies, laments, rhythms to soothe the living or to accompany the dead. In fact, across many cultures today, funeral songs share a striking similarity. They are slow, repetitive, and mournful, often built from only a few notes. Could it be that these patterns echo back to the Ice Age, when humans first began to turn grief into melody? A child's death in particular might have birthed sound as remembrance. Mothers across cultures have always sung to their infants, rocking them with lullabies before sleep. When the baby dies, that instinct does not vanish. The song remains, now filled with absence. Perhaps the mother hummed the lullaby one last time, even as her child could no longer hear it. Perhaps others joined her, soft voices weaving together into a chorus of sorrow. Music was more than expression. It was a bridge. In sound, grief found release. Pain which could not be carved into words was carved into rhythm. And unlike objects, beads, carvings, bones, music was alive. It filled the cold night, echoing off stone walls, seeping into the ears of every member of the group. It united them in vibration, in resonance. Picture a fire glowing in the frozen dark. The tribe sits close, the body of the child nearby. Someone begins to hum a low, pulsing note. Others join, each slightly different, until the sound is like the breathing of the earth itself. This is not music as entertainment. It is music as survival, a way to hold one another together when the world feels shattered. Even without instruments, humans are instruments themselves. The chest cavity, the throat, the hand striking thighs or clapping slowly, these could have created the first funeral rhythms. In time, bones and sticks may have been tapped, flutes carved from bird bones played. But even before such inventions, the voice itself was enough. The voice was the oldest tool of memory. And so, the child who froze before her first birthday may have inspired one of the earliest songs without words. A melody too simple to be written, too fragile to survive millennia, yet powerful enough to ripple through the hearts of those who sang it. Today, we still hear echoes of this ancient practice, in laments sung by women in the Caucasus Mountains, in the wailing traditions of Irish funerals, in the keening of Middle Eastern rituals. All share a common structure, repetition, rhythm, a voice that wavers between sob and song. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. Across 30,000 years, humans have never lost the need to turn grief into sound. Why sound? Because sound dissolves boundaries. Words divide us with meaning, but tones unite us through feeling. A sob needs no translation. A wail is understood by all. A lullaby hum, even without lyrics, communicates comfort. These primal sounds may have been humanity's first universal language, one born in sorrow, carried through song. For the tribe, this song without words did something else as well. It carried the child forward. In each repetition of the melody, her presence lingered. Each hum became a vessel for memory. Each wail stretched her short life a little longer in the minds of those gathered. She was gone, but in the vibrations of their throats, she lived again. There is also a practical element. Music regulates emotion. Neuroscience shows us that rhythm can calm the nervous system, synchronize heartbeats, and ease distress. The Ice Age people did not know this consciously, but they felt it. As they hummed together, their grief softened. As they sang, the unbearable became bearable. We must remember, too, that these early songs were not only for the dead, they were for the living. For the siblings who did not understand why their sister was gone. For the parents whose arms felt empty. For the elders who had seen death many times but still needed to soothe the tribe. Song was not only memorial, it was medicine. The frozen child then becomes part of something larger than her short life. She becomes the spark for sound, for music that has echoed across human history. Without knowing it, she may have inspired the first rhythms of mourning, the first melodies of comfort. When we listen today to a mother humming to her baby, or to a community singing together at a funeral, we are hearing something ancient. We are hearing the voice of prehistory, of tribes gathered around fires, of parents singing to children they could not save. We are hearing songs without words, songs born of loss, songs that carried memory when nothing else could. And in that sound, fragile, fleeting, gone as soon as the air shifts, lies a paradox. The most temporary form of remembrance became the most enduring. Carvings erode, bones decay, but music, though it vanishes the moment it is made, has lasted across millennia in the continuity of human practice. The frozen child may never have spoken, but through song, she continues to be heard. A child's burial is never only about the past. It is also about the future, the futures that will now never unfold. When the tribe lowered the small frozen body into the ground, they were not just saying farewell to what had been. They were mourning the life that would not be, the laughter that would never echo, the footsteps that would never press into snow, the children she would never bear. In burying her, they were burying possibility. For hunter-gatherers, each child carried more than personal hope. A child was the promise of continuity, the assurance that the lineage, the tribe, the knowledge, and the songs would move forward into tomorrow. In the harshness of the Ice Age, numbers mattered. One fewer child meant one less pair of hands to gather berries, one less body to carry wood, one less hunter, one less singer. The loss reverberated not just through the hearts of the parents, but through the tribe's entire survival strategy. This is why the burial of a child in prehistory was so poignant. Adults had lived and contributed, their death was sorrowful but expected. A child's death struck deeper, because it severed a path into the future. Anthropologists sometimes call these futures truncated, lives cut short before they could branch outward. In archaeology, we find small graves with beads, with ochre, with tenderly arranged bones. The care lavished on these burials suggests something profound. The community was not only mourning a life lost, but a life unlived. Picture the moment. The mother's eyes are dry now, emptied of tears. The father's hands shake as he helps dig the grave. The elders watch, faces heavy, remembering their own children lost long ago. And the younger sibling stands silently, perhaps confused, perhaps afraid. Into this small grave goes more than a body. Into it goes the tribe's vision of tomorrow. In many human cultures, the burial of children carries an especially strong ritual weight. Some societies imagine the child as returning to the spirit world from which it came, as if it had never fully entered this one. Others see the child as a guide, a messenger, a soul already close to the ancestors. The Ice Age tribe may not have had a word for afterlife, as we do, but they surely had an instinct for continuity, the sense that death was not an end but a passage. It is possible they believed the child's spirit would remain near, woven into the winds, the stars, or the animals that moved across the tundra. Perhaps they thought she would return in another child, reborn into the group. Perhaps the red ochre sprinkled over her body was not only a symbol of life but a plea for regeneration, a hope that although this child had frozen, life itself would not. The future mattered because survival demanded it. For every Ice Age group, extinction was a constant threat. A season of poor hunting, an outbreak of sickness, or the loss of too many infants could spell the end of a lineage. Thus, burying a child was also a confrontation with fragility, the awareness that the tribe's hold on existence was thin, precarious, easily broken. And yet, the very act of burial shows resilience. To place a child gently in the earth is to say, we will not let her vanish without meaning. We will weave her into the story of who we are. Even in her absence, she shapes us. The act transforms despair into narrative. Through ritual, the tribe ensured that her short life continued to influence their collective journey. There is a philosophical paradox here. By burying the child, the tribe faced the buried future, but they also created a future, not for the child, but for themselves. Each act of remembrance, each ritual performed, became a building block of human culture. In grieving, they invented tradition. In mourning, they invented meaning. When we look at the archaeological record, we find these traces, small graves with astonishing care. A baby in Italy, buried with shell beads. An infant in Siberia, wrapped in red ochre. A tiny child in France, laid to rest with a carved ivory pendant. These burials are, in some cases, more elaborate than those of adults. Why? Because the tribe was not only burying a person, they were confronting the question of what it means to lose the future. The frozen child then becomes both absence and presence. Her body was small, her life brief, but her death forced the group to look forward as much as backward. What would become of them if more children died? What story could they tell to make this loss survivable? In the grave, the child was gone. But in memory, she became a guardian of continuity. This section of the story touches something universal. Even today, when a child dies, families and communities feel not only grief but also rupture. The what-ifs echo endlessly. What if she had grown? What if she had laughed? What if she had loved? These echoes are not modern inventions. They are ancient. The Ice Age parents must have asked them too, in their own way. The grave was not only an ending. It was a question mark carved into the snow. And yet, despite the despair, humans continued. They buried their dead and still bore more children. They grieved and still hunted, still gathered, still sang. This is the resilience of our species, to bury the future, but to go on building one anyway. The child's absence became a weight carried forward, shaping choices, shaping traditions, shaping the way humans would forever see life and death. So when we speak of the buried future, we are not speaking only of the child who froze before her first birthday. We are speaking of humanity's reckoning with fragility, with loss, with the fact that no tomorrow is guaranteed. And yet, in every grave, in every ritual, in every song, humans found ways to keep walking toward tomorrow. The frozen child is not only a symbol of endings, she is also a symbol of beginnings, of the very human act of facing despair, and still choosing to continue. When the tribe buried the frozen child, they did not know who would find her thousands of years later. They could not imagine archaeologists with brushes and trowels carefully peeling back layers of earth. They could not imagine cameras, books, museums, or documentaries. They knew only that, in the act of burial, they were preserving something. They were asserting, this life mattered. And yet, in ways they could never have foreseen, their act of remembrance has endured. Millennia later, the ice preserved what time usually devours. In rare sites, the cold became a keeper of memory, halting decay and holding small bodies in suspended silence. Archaeologists who stumble upon such graves are not just discovering bones. They are entering into a conversation across time. They kneel in the soil, and as their brushes uncover beads, ochre, or a fragile jawbone, they are touched by the echo of ancient grief. There is something haunting in these discoveries. A grave dug 30,000 years ago can still carry the power of the moment it was made. A mother's gesture of placing a bead beside her child becomes legible. A smear of red ochre still stains the soil with symbolic intent. The silence of the grave is broken not by words but by recognition. We see you, we understand. For the archaeologist, it is impossible not to feel the humanity radiating from such finds. Science demands measurement, cataloging, classification. But beneath the data lies a tremor of emotion. To hold the tiny bones of an Ice Age infant is to feel, however briefly, the weight of a loss that transcends eras. It is no longer only about anthropology. It is about empathy. These graves are echoes across millennia because they prove that memory is not only stored in minds. It can be stored in earth, in symbols, in the arrangement of bodies and objects. Every burial is a message, a whisper into the future. Remember us, remember them, remember what we felt. And we do. Modern people who stand before ancient child burials often find themselves unsettled. Museums sometimes hesitate to display them, fearing to intrude upon their sanctity. Visitors report tears, a sense of intimacy, even of guilt. Because to look upon the frozen child is to realize, the grief that tribe felt is the grief we would feel. 30,000 years collapse in an instant. Their sorrow is our sorrow. This collapse of time is profound. History often feels distant, abstract, lists of kings, wars, inventions. But a child's grave cuts through abstraction. It does not matter that she lived in the Ice Age, that she never knew our words, our tools, our cities. The image of a small body laid gently in earth needs no translation. It is the most human of gestures. It says, we loved her, we mourned her, we could not let her vanish without care. In this way, the frozen child speaks more clearly than many other artifacts. Tools, carvings, or shelters tell us what humans did. Graves tell us what humans felt. And feelings are what bind us most tightly across time. There is also a strange paradox here. The child's short life ended before her first birthday. Yet, in being buried, she became immortal in a way her living tribe could not have imagined. Her death, frozen in time, has outlasted entire civilizations, languages, and empires. She has reached us. And in reaching us, she changes us. When archaeologists publish papers, when museums curate exhibits, when storytellers weave documentaries, the child continues to live, not as a body, but as a memory. Her brief existence is magnified into meaning. Not in words, not in language, but in silence. in the arrangement of bones and ochre, in the careful curve of a grave dug in frozen ground. Her voice is soft, but it carries farther than the shouts of kings. The frozen child, who never reached her first birthday, still echoes. And in listening, we too become part of the continuity she represents. Human beings are fragile. We know this in the abstract, but rarely do we confront it directly. We live as though our days are endless, as though the rhythm of eating, sleeping, and waking will stretch on forever. But the frozen child forces us to pause. She reminds us that life is not promised, that existence is a delicate thread stretched between birth and death, and that thread can snap at any moment. The Ice Age people understood this far more intimately than we do. Every parent who cradled a newborn knew that the chances of survival were slim. Illness, hunger, cold, predators, all were constant threats. To love a child was to live with the shadow of loss hovering just beyond reach. And yet, they loved anyway. They risked the pain because love was stronger than fear. That choice, to love while knowing fragility, is one of the most profound truths of the human condition. It is easy to care about what seems permanent. It is far harder, and far more meaningful, to pour love into something that might vanish tomorrow. The frozen child embodies that paradox. She did not live to grow, but she was surrounded by love so strong it sought to protect her memory against time itself. When we contemplate her burial, we are really contemplating fragility itself. Life is short, uncertain, and often cruel. And yet, in that fragility lies beauty. A flower that lasts one day is no less radiant. A song that ends after a few notes is no less moving. Fragility sharpens value. It reminds us that what we hold can slip away, and so we must hold it tighter, with more reverence. There is also humility in fragility. Modern humans sometimes imagine ourselves as conquerors of nature, as masters of science, as beings who have subdued the wilderness. But the frozen child whispers otherwise. She reminds us that for most of history we were not masters, but survivors. And even now, with all our technology, fragility has not disappeared. We remain one illness, one accident, one chance event away from loss. The Ice Age did not invent fragility, it only revealed it more clearly. Philosophers through the ages have wrestled with this truth. Some have sought to deny fragility, dreaming of immortality. Others have embraced it, seeing in mortality the very essence of meaning. If life stretched endlessly, would love carry the same intensity? Would joy strike us with the same force? It is because things end that they matter. The frozen child, though she did not live long, mattered immensely. Her life mattered to her family, and her death continues to matter to us 30,000 years later. Fragility does not erase significance. It deepens it. There is also a moral weight in this recognition. When we realize how fragile life is, how easily it can break, we are called to treat one another with greater care, to handle each human being as if they are precious, because they are. The tribe who buried the frozen child understood this instinctively. Their burial was not only about mourning, it was about affirming value. Even in the face of fragility, they declared, this life was worth everything. The philosophy of fragility also challenges how we think about strength. We often imagine strength as invulnerability, as power that cannot be broken. But perhaps true strength lies in embracing fragility, in holding close what we know can be lost. To grieve is not weakness. To mourn is not failure. It is the ultimate acknowledgement of connection. The parents who buried their child were not defeated by fragility, they were made profoundly human by it. In our world today, we often avoid fragility. We build systems that hide death, institutions that mask grief, technologies that promise permanence. But the truth remains, we are fragile beings. And fragility is not a flaw in the design, it is the design. It is what makes our choices, our loves, and our moments shimmer with urgency. The frozen child is a reminder we did not ask for, but perhaps one we need. There is a strange beauty in knowing that a life so short can ripple so far. She never spoke a word, never took her first steps, never saw a summer. And yet, she became a philosopher's teacher. She reminds us that duration is not the measure of meaning. Intensity is. Connection is. Memory is. Even in fragility, perhaps especially in fragility, meaning is born. Some might ask, why dwell on such sorrow? Why linger on the grave of a child long gone? Because fragility is not only about endings, it is also about beginnings. The burial of the child was not only the close of her life, it was the opening of a story that would reach us across 30 millennia. Fragility made her story delicate, but also luminous. Without fragility, there would be no echo. Without fragility, there would be no bridge. This is the paradox we are left with. Fragility is both the wound and the gift. It breaks us, and it makes us. It steals, and it deepens. To live is to accept fragility. To love is to embrace it fully, knowing that loss will follow, but refusing to let that knowledge diminish the gift of connection. The frozen child teaches us this without words. Her short life was fragile, her body fragile, her tribe fragile in the face of the Ice Age. And yet, through their care, through their insistence on remembering, fragility became endurance. Their love, fragile and fleeting in the moment, became unbreakable across time. This is the philosophy of fragility, that the delicate can endure, that the fleeting can echo, that the smallest of lives can hold the greatest of meanings. To be human is to be breakable. But to be human is also to transform that breakability into memory, into continuity, into love that does not end when breath does. And so, as we reflect on the frozen child, we are invited to look at our own lives differently, to see our fragile moments not as failures, but as the essence of what makes us alive, to recognize that fragility is not something to overcome, but something to embrace. It is in fragility that we discover what truly matters. The Ice Age was never kind. Winters stretched endlessly, winds cut like knives, and snow buried the land in silence. For the people who lived then, survival was never guaranteed. And yet, within that unforgiving world, there were moments of tenderness, small flames of love and meaning that refused to be extinguished. The frozen child is one of those flames, preserved across time, still flickering in our imagination 30,000 years later. We began with a simple image, a child who froze before her first birthday. At first glance, it is a story of sorrow, a story of loss. But as we have journeyed deeper, it has become clear that this child represents more than death. She represents survival through memory. She represents the love of a community that could not stop the cold, but could refuse to let her vanish into nothingness. When her tribe laid her in the earth, wrapped perhaps in furs, protected with care, they were not only saying goodbye, they were sending her forward, into the soil, into time, into us. Their ritual carved a channel through history, one that would one day allow us to discover her, to remember her, to reflect on her fragile existence. In that act, they created not only an ending, but a beginning. There is something haunting in this, that a child who never walked could travel farther than most humans ever will. That a life so short could stretch so wide, reaching across continents and millennia to find an audience of millions. She has become a teacher, a reminder, a mirror. She reminds us that even the smallest stories matter, that even the briefest lives can echo. And in that sense, the frozen child is not only a figure of the past. She belongs to us now. We carry her in our imagination, in our reflections, in the emotions she stirs. When we think of her, we think also of the children we have lost, the loved ones who have slipped away, the fragility we try so hard to ignore. She becomes a symbol not only of Ice Age sorrow, but of the universal human condition. Her tribe could not have imagined this. To them, she was simply their child, their blood, their grief. They did not bury her for us, and yet their act became a message. They did not preserve her for history, and yet history remembered her anyway. This is the paradox of memory. What begins in private love can grow into universal meaning. The Ice Age has ended. The glaciers retreated, the great beasts vanished, the tribes dispersed and evolved into the billions of us alive today. But the frozen child remains. She stands as a bridge between then and now, a thread of continuity woven through the chaos of time. The cold that killed her preserved her story. The grief that buried her preserved her meaning. And so, we return to the title. The child who froze before her first birthday. It is a story of finality, yes, but it is also a story of endurance. She froze, but her memory thawed in us. She died, but her story lives. She was fragile, but her meaning is endless. There is a deep lesson here. We often measure life in years, in achievements, in milestones reached. But perhaps we are measuring wrongly. Perhaps life is not about length, but about connection. Not about what we accomplish, but about what we mean to others. By that measure, the frozen child's life was not incomplete. It was whole. Her short existence became infinite because it touched those around her, and through them, it touches us. The final winter of her life was brutal. The endless memory that followed is gentle. These two truths coexist, bound together. In the end, this is what it means to be human. To live fragile lives under harsh conditions, yet to create meaning that lasts longer than the flesh that carried it. If we step back even further, beyond anthropology, beyond history, what we are really left with is a meditation on existence itself. The frozen child story is the human story in miniature, fleeting, fragile, but capable of transcending time through love and memory. Her silence speaks across ages. Her absence becomes presence. And so, as we close this journey, imagine one last scene. The Ice Age night is quiet. Snow drifts gently, settling over a small grave. A fire flickers nearby, surrounded by figures huddled close, mourning in silence. They do not know that their grief will echo for millennia. They do not know that their child will be remembered long after their names are lost. They only know that love demanded they do something, however small, however fragile, to honor her. That act, that burial, was the seed of memory. From that seed grew a story that outlived glaciers, outlived mammoths, outlived the Ice Age itself. It grew until it reached us, here, now, watching and listening. The child who froze before her first birthday did not vanish into the snow. She became part of the endless memory of what it means to be human. And maybe that is the true immortality, not in escaping death, but in ensuring that love once given does not fade, in ensuring that memory once planted continues to grow. The Ice Age ends. The winters pass. The glaciers melt. But memory does not. The frozen child remains, forever fragile, forever remembered, forever human.